Okay, we're with Annie Petsonk of the Environmental Defense Fund. She's the only woman I know here who carries a copy of the U.S. Constitution and the Kyoto Protocol in her backpack. So I think this is a good person to talk to about the legal issues here. We've got two things on the table right now that I want to talk about: the Kyoto Protocol and this new legally binding treaty. Why are they different? What's the difference between the two here? What in the negotiating halls?
The Kyoto Protocol, which was adopted in 1997, has a set of legally binding targets for industrialized countries that are listed in an annex to the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol establishes targets and market mechanisms for meeting those targets, including the clean development mechanism. And many, particularly developing countries here, want to continue the Kyoto Protocol and continue its market mechanisms, in particular the CDM, or clean development mechanism. The Kyoto Protocol is a pretty clunky instrument in some ways, in that it's hard to change it. It's hard to extend its targets. It's hard to bring new countries into it. And so the European Union has said they are only willing to agree to an extension of the Kyoto Protocol if a new protocol is adopted that would be legally binding, with legally binding targets, and would bring in a broader array of countries over time into caps on emissions and market mechanisms. So their goal is to broaden the coverage so that more emissions in the world are covered by legally binding caps. The European Union comprises, they've said, somewhere between 12 and 15% of global emissions. If you add the coverage of the other countries who have caps under Kyoto, you might get that up to 18 to 20% of the countries, for countries that are considering going into the extension of it. And that's simply just not enough coverage under binding caps. We need a broader instrument.
So in terms of that broader instrument, they're also negotiating some steps to get towards that here. There are three options on the table, is that right? Tell us what those are.
The options are, first, a protocol that would be negotiated by the end of next year and adopted and entered into force by 2015. The second option is a negotiation toward a legally binding outcome, but with no deadlines. And the third option is simply a set of decisions, similar to the decisions that we've had over the past years coming out of Cancun and Bali and Copenhagen and Poznan, decisions about doing more, but nothing legally binding. And in my opinion, we need something legally binding because there's nothing like a legal obligation with a target and a deadline for undertaking a commitment to focus the minds of companies and countries and communities on getting the job done.
And you've been following these negotiations very closely. Are there countries that are pushing for that legally binding agreement here?
Yes, there are. In particular, the European Union, the Association of the Small Island State Countries who are, and the least developing countries who are really among the most vulnerable, those smaller countries, are all pushing for the legally binding protocol. The United States, interestingly, has opposed having a legally binding instrument be launched for negotiation at this meeting, and we're very disappointed about that and working to try to change the U.S. position. But if the U.S. position will not change, then the U.S. should stand aside and let the other countries here move forward.
Why do you think the U.S. opposes legally binding commitments?
I think there are really two reasons, Jeff. The first is I think they're concerned that they might not be able to get enough votes in the U.S. Senate for the U.S. to ratify a new treaty on climate change. And I understand that concern. We were not able to get 60 votes in the U.S. Senate for climate change legislation a couple of years ago. It's hard to see how we would, in the near term, meet the higher threshold of 67 votes for a treaty. At the same time, I think there's a genuine belief on the part of many in the administration that we don't need binding targets, that pledges and decisions are sufficient. And I would say that most other countries here disagree with that view.
But the U.S. has signed up to other legally binding treaties in the past, haven't they?
It's interesting. The U.S. led the development of the Montreal Protocol on the ozone layer, which has legally binding targets and which has been very successful in phasing out the use of chlorofluorocarbons and other ozone layer depleting chemicals. The U.S. is a leader in the Washington Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. It was done in Washington, D.C. And there are many other environmental agreements where the U.S. is a leader. The U.S. is a party to or a contracting party to the World Trade Organization, which has binding targets and consequences if you don't comply. So why the U.S. is not supporting binding targets here is really anomalous in my view.
Do you have any ideas of why that is?
Well, like I said, I think they're worried about not being able to get 67 votes, and I do think there is a philosophical difference that they think that on climate change, if they cannot get 67 votes in the Senate, they think it's better to start with a set of pledges. However, countries have had years of pledges. The original Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was done in 1992, contained a pledge, an aim to return U.S. emissions to 1990 levels by 2000. A treaty with a voluntary pledge, and the U.S. did not meet that voluntary pledge. So the rest of the world is very skeptical when the U.S. says pledges are enough.
What's the role of oil industry and lobbyists in all this?
It's a very interesting one. There are portions of the oil industry, not all oil companies, but portions of it, that have consistently opposed any legally binding target for the United States. And they have campaigned over the years to sow doubt into the minds of the public and journalists about the science of climate change, because they believe that if the public ever became convinced that climate change was really a problem, the public would demand binding targets and legal requirements to cut global warming pollution.
You said the United States should step aside if they're not willing to sign up to binding commitments. How would that look in practice?
That's a great question, and it brings up actually the question of how this body, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, makes decisions. The Framework Convention makes decisions by consensus. Any single party can block the adoption of a decision. Why is that? It's because when the Framework Convention was first established, a grouping of oil companies got together and lobbied oil-producing countries to oppose having any rules of procedure that would enable this body to take decisions by a vote. The government of Mexico has put forward a proposal here in Durban to change that, to amend the Framework Convention to allow the parties to make decisions by majority vote. And if we reach a crescendo over the next 24 hours where it looks like it may not be possible to reach a consensus on launching a new binding agreement, and it looks like only a few countries are standing in opposition to launching negotiations on a new binding agreement, then the Mexican proposal to amend the convention and change the rules of decision will get considerable attention.
And you've been in the negotiating rooms following these very closely the last couple of days. Have you seen any shifting in positions, or does everyone seem locked in?
On a number of issues, there's been very good progress. In particular, in the area of climate finance, we're seeing real movement on all sides, and that's very positive, and I'm hopeful for an outcome here on the climate finance area. But on the big picture of extending the Kyoto Protocol and launching a new legal mandate, I have thus far not seen the kind of movement it would take to bridge the gaps between the countries.
You've done a lot of these negotiations in the past. Is it too late to see movement, or could something still happen?
It's still, it's not early in the process. Yesterday was early in the process. Today is the middle of the process. Tonight is going to be a long night, and tomorrow night may be an even longer night. So there's still a chance to have a good outcome here. But as each hour passes, it diminishes.
Great. We'll keep checking back in with you, Annie. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks.